graduate student at Liberty University. Tonight, I'm going to be discussing Carla Gardina Pestana's 1993 article, The Quaker Executions as Myth and History, published in the Journal of American History. In her article, she discusses the executions of 4 Quaker missionaries, Marmaduke Stevenson, William Robinson, Mary Dyer, and William Ladra, by the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony between 1659 and 1661. Her article focuses on the dichotomy of the Puritan and Quaker narratives that have emerged over time regarding the executions. The early Quaker missionaries were far from the pacifist Quakers we see later in history. Pestana writes that the early Quakers were more aggressive preachers, hearkening back to the Old Testament, while the later Quakers were more like the loving and forgiving Christ of the New Testament. John Wisner writes in his 2016 article that one of the martyrs, Mary Dyer, wrote 2 letters after her first sentence of execution that was eventually stayed. The first was an aggressive letter wrote in the style of typical of women Quakers at the time, with millennial exhortations, prophetic writings, and divine judgments. It was more judgment and less doctrine. The second was wrote the day after the executions of Marmaduke Stevenson and William Robinson. It was more tame, but it exhorted the court and furthered the martyr narrative by proclaiming that she was acting in obedience to God. After 1660, the newly pacifist Quakers needed to justify the aggressiveness of the past missionaries with their current teachings, so they focused on them as martyrs. In 1700, Daniel Gould published a brief narration of the suffering of the people called the Quakers, in which he called Stevenson and Robinson harmless, innocent, and peaceable. The Puritans, on the other hand, needed to justify their actions and retold the story differently. They saw the Quakers as a satanic ploy to disrupt their holy experiment in the New World. Cotton Mather attempted to retell the story as a group fleeing for religious freedom and a sanctuary in the wilderness. Even the Puritan jeremiads called the toleration of the Quaker missionaries after 1660 as one of the colony's sins, and the presence of a small Quaker community was a sign of God's anger. In his 2018 book, Michael Winship writes that John Norton wrote a treatise in which he wrote, Massachusetts would violate its covenant with God and bring down his wrath on itself if it did not suppress the heretical Quakers. Cotton Mather summed up the Puritan beliefs when he wrote, if the reader inquire with what spirit they died, I must sincerely say that as far as I can learn, they showed little enough of the spirit of martyrdom. They did not die like the true martyrs of Jesus Christ, with the glorious spirit of God resting on them. A fierce, raging, sullen, a revengeful spirit, and a degree of madness rather inspired them. In the end, it seems even with their justifications for the executions, the intolerance of a group seeking religious freedom made the Puritans the bad guys in the eyes of history. In fact, a statue of Mary Dyer now sits at the Massachusetts State House as a symbol of religious freedom.